The sound of 20 strangers laughing and splashing in my backyard pool hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I stood there in my own driveway, keys still in my hand, staring at the impossible scene unfolding behind my house. Karen had done it again, but this time she had crossed a line that would change everything between us forever. My heart pounded as I watched her lounging in my pool chair like she owned the place, directing her guests to help themselves to my pool supplies. The woman who had spent months pushing every boundary I set had finally gone too far. She had no idea that I had installed security cameras. She had no idea that I had upgraded to smart locks on my pool gate. And she definitely had no idea what I was about to do next. That moment, standing in my own driveway looking at 20 trespassers in my pool, I realized something that would change the entire game. Karen had just walked into a trap of her own making. 3 years ago, I made a decision that would define my entire adult life. I was going to build the perfect backyard oasis. Not just any pool, but a stunning centerpiece that would be the crown jewel of my property. I worked double shifts for 18 months straight, saved every penny, and sacrificed vacations and dinners out. My friends thought I was crazy, but I had a vision. The pool company finished the installation on a perfect spring morning. The water sparkled like diamonds under the morning sun. Custom LED lighting would turn the entire area into a magical wonderland at night. I had invested in a top-tier filtration system that kept the water crystal clear year-round. The deck was natural stone, carefully selected to complement the landscaping that I had designed myself. Every evening after work, I would sit by that pool with a cold drink and feel the stress of the day melt away. Weekend mornings became sacred time, floating on my back and watching the clouds drift overhead. When my family visited, we would spend hours laughing and making memories in that perfect blue sanctuary. The pool represented everything I had worked for as a homeowner. But paradise always has a serpent, and mine lived right next door. Karen had been my neighbor for 5 years, and in that time she had perfected the art of boundary violations. It started small. She would use my driveway to turn around when hers was blocked. Then she began taking my delivered packages when I was not home, claiming she was just helping. Tools would disappear from my garage, only to reappear weeks later in her yard. Each incident was just small enough that confronting her seemed petty. But together, they painted a picture of someone who believed that being neighborly meant having access to whatever she wanted from my property. I tried to be understanding. Maybe she was lonely. Maybe she did not realize how her actions affected others. I kept telling myself that good neighbors find ways to get along. After the third time I caught her borrowing my lawn mower without asking, I installed security cameras around my property. The system was state-of-the-art, with motion detection and smartphone alerts. I even upgraded my pool gate to a smart lock system that I could control remotely. My friends joked that I was becoming paranoid, but I called it being prepared. Karen noticed the cameras immediately. She asked pointed questions about why I needed such extensive security in our safe neighborhood. I gave her vague answers about package theft and general peace of mind. What I did not tell her was that I had started documenting every single one of her boundary violations. The cameras were not just for security anymore. They were for evidence. The pool became her obsession almost immediately. Every time she was in her backyard, I could feel her watching me swim. She made comments about how lucky I was to have such a beautiful setup. She wondered out loud how often I actually used it, since she never saw me out there during the day when she was home. The comments felt innocent enough, but something in her tone always made me uncomfortable. Last month, during a neighborhood barbecue, I caught her standing at my pool gate, running her fingers along the smart lock mechanism. When I asked what she was doing, She laughed it off and said she was just admiring the technology. But I noticed her lingering near the gate when I opened it to show other neighbors the pool area. I watched her eyes follow my movements as I entered the gate code. That night, I changed the access code and made a mental note to be more careful about who was watching when I used the lock. Karen's interest in my pool was becoming more than neighborly curiosity. It was becoming something that made me genuinely concerned about the security of my property and my peace of mind. Friday morning started like any other day. I kissed my wife goodbye, grabbed my coffee, and headed to work with plans dancing in my head. The weather forecast promised a perfect weekend, and I was already imagining floating in my pool Saturday morning. Maybe I would invite a few close friends over for an evening swim. The week had been brutal at the office, and I desperately needed some relaxation time. My morning meetings dragged on forever, but by lunchtime, my boss delivered unexpected good news. The client presentation scheduled for the afternoon had been postponed until Monday. I could leave early and start my weekend ahead of schedule. The drive home felt like pure freedom, windows down, music up, anticipating hours of peaceful pool time ahead of me. As I turned onto my street, something felt different. There were cars parked everywhere, vehicles I did not recognize lining both sides of the road. My neighborhood was usually quiet during weekday afternoons with most people at work or school, but today looked like someone was throwing a major event. I counted at least 8 unfamiliar cars as I pulled into my driveway. The moment I stepped out of my car, I heard it: music, laughter, the unmistakable sound of people having a pool party, but that was impossible. None of my immediate neighbors had pools. The only pool in this section of the neighborhood was mine, and I certainly had not given anyone permission to use it. My stomach dropped as the horrible realization began to dawn on me. The sounds were coming from my backyard. The music was coming from my pool area. People were in my pool, using my property without my knowledge or permission. I stood frozen in my driveway, trying to process what was happening. I walked slowly toward my backyard, each step feeling heavier than the last. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and started recording. Whatever was happening back there, I was going to document every second of it. The closer I got to my backyard, the louder the sounds became. There had to be 20 people back there, maybe more. When I finally reached the corner of my house and could see into my backyard, the scene that greeted me was beyond my worst nightmares. My beautiful pool area had been transformed into a full-scale party zone. Strangers were swimming in my pool, using my pool chairs, helping themselves to the pool supplies I kept stored in my deck box. Someone had brought a portable speaker and was blasting music loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. And there, sitting in my favorite pool chair like she was the hostess of her own event, was Karen. She was wearing a swimsuit and sunglasses, holding a drink, and directing people around my pool area like she owned the place. She was pointing out features of my pool to her guests, explaining how the LED lighting system worked, showing off my custom deck like it was her own personal achievement. I watched in stunned silence as she told someone to grab towels from my storage cabinet. I saw her guests helping themselves to the pool equipment I had spent thousands of dollars purchasing. Children I had never seen before were playing with my pool toys, while their parents lounged on my furniture and acted like this was completely normal. The violation felt deeper than anything I had ever experienced. This was not just trespassing. This was Karen treating my private sanctuary like her personal entertainment venue. She had somehow gotten past my locked gate, brought 20 strangers onto my property, and turned my peaceful backyard into her own private party space. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold my phone steady, but I kept recording. Every face, every conversation, every detail of this incredible violation of my property and privacy. Karen had finally gone too far, and I was going to make sure I had evidence of every single second of her trespass. But even as my anger built to levels I had never experienced before, a small part of my brain was already working on strategy. Karen thought she was clever, but she had just made the biggest mistake of her entitled life. She had no idea what was about to happen next. I took a deep breath and stepped into full view of my backyard, phone still recording everything. The conversation and laughter continued for several seconds before people began to notice me standing there. One by one, the party guests stopped talking and turned to stare at me. The music kept playing, but an uncomfortable silence settled over my pool area. Karen was the last person to notice me. She was in the middle of explaining to someone how I had installed the underwater lighting system when she finally looked up and saw me standing there. For just a moment, her confident expression faltered. But then, incredibly, she smiled and waved at me like I was a welcomed guest at her party. "Oh, hi there," she called out cheerfully, as if finding me in my own backyard was a pleasant surprise. "I hope you do not mind, but I brought a few friends over to enjoy this gorgeous pool. You never seem to use it during the day anyway." I stared at her in complete disbelief. Even by Karen's standards, this level of entitlement was breathtaking. She was sitting in my pool chair, surrounded by 20 strangers using my pool, and acting like I was the one who should be apologizing for interrupting. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building inside me, "how did you get into my pool area? The gate is locked with a security code." She laughed and took a sip of her drink. "Oh, that old thing? I figured out the code weeks ago. I saw you entering it during the neighborhood barbecue. It was not very hard to remember." My blood ran cold. She had been watching me, memorizing my security code, planning this violation for weeks. This was not a spontaneous decision or a misunderstanding. This was calculated, premeditated trespassing. "Karen, you need to get everyone out of my pool area immediately," I said, raising my voice so everyone could hear me clearly. "This is private property, and none of you have permission to be here." Several of her guests looked uncomfortable and started moving toward the edge of the pool, but Karen held up her hand to stop them. "Now hold on just a minute," she said, standing up from my chair. "This is ridiculous. You have this beautiful pool that sits empty most of the time. What harm is there in letting people enjoy it when you are not even home?" "The harm is that this is my property," I replied, my patience finally snapping. "I work hard to maintain this pool. I pay for the chemicals, the electricity, the cleaning, everything. You do not get to decide when other people can use my private property." Karen crossed her arms and glared at me. "You know what your problem is? You are selfish. You have all this space and luxury, and you cannot stand the thought of sharing it with your neighbors. This is exactly what is wrong with people like you." I could not believe what I was hearing. She had trespassed on my property, brought 20 strangers into my backyard without permission, and now she was calling me selfish for objecting to it. Her entitlement had reached levels that seemed almost pathological. "People like me?" I repeated. "You mean people who respect property rights and expect the same from their neighbors?" "I mean people who are so obsessed with their possessions that they forget how to be human," Karen shot back. "Look around you. Everyone is having a wonderful time. No one is hurting anything. But you cannot stand that because you did not get to control it." Some of her guests were clearly embarrassed by the confrontation and wanted to leave. but others were nodding along with Karen's argument, apparently convinced that I was being unreasonable. The mob mentality was starting to take hold, with Karen as their righteous leader against my supposed selfishness. "This is not about control," I said, still recording everything on my phone. "This is about basic respect for other people's property. You do not have the right to use my pool just because you want to." Karen laughed mockingly. "Rights? What about the right to community? What about the right to human decency? You are standing there with your phone like some kind of security guard, treating your neighbors like criminals." I looked around at the 20 strangers floating in my pool, sitting on my furniture, using my property like it belonged to them. The surreal nature of the situation was almost overwhelming. I was being lectured about human decency by someone who had committed calculated trespassing. "Everyone needs to leave now," I said firmly. "If you are not out of my pool area in 5 minutes, I am calling the police." Karen's eyes flashed with anger. "Go ahead and call them. I will tell them exactly how you treat your neighbors. We will see who they think is the real problem here." That was when I realized something that changed everything. Karen and her 20 guests were trapped in my fenced pool area, and I was the only one with the code to get out. Karen stood there with her arms crossed, radiating defiance and self-righteousness. Her guests were looking back and forth between us, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation but unsure whose side to take. The pool area felt like a powder keg ready to explode, and Karen was holding the match. "You know what?" she announced loudly to her guests. "We do not have to listen to this. This is America, and neighbors should be able to share community resources. He cannot force us to leave just because he wants to be petty and controlling." Several of her guests nodded in agreement. One man even stepped forward and said, "Yeah, man, what is the big deal? It is just a pool. We are not hurting anything." I watched in amazement as Karen successfully turned my own pool area into hostile territory against me. She had trespassed on my property, brought strangers into my backyard, and now she was painting me as the villain for wanting them to leave. The manipulation was masterful and completely infuriating. "We are staying," Karen declared triumphantly. "If you want us gone, you are going to have to drag us out yourself, and I would love to see you try." Her guests cheered and applauded her defiant stand. Someone turned the music back up. People returned to swimming and lounging like nothing had happened. Karen sat back down in my pool chair with a satisfied smirk, like she had just won a major victory. But as I stood there watching this incredible display of entitlement, something clicked in my brain. Karen was so focused on winning the confrontation that she had forgotten one crucial detail. She was trapped. My pool area was completely enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence. The only way in or out was through the gate, which was secured by a smart lock system that I controlled from my phone. Karen had gotten in by copying my code, but she had no idea that I could override the manual code entry with my smartphone app. I looked at Karen holding court in my pool chair, completely confident in her victory. I looked at her 20 guests, all of them now fully committed to supporting her defiant stand against my unreasonable demands. They had chosen their side, and they were all in with Karen's narrative. "Perfect." I pulled out my phone and pretended to be calling the police. "Yes, I need to report trespassers on my property," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. But instead of dialing 911, I opened my smart lock app and navigated to the pool gate controls. Karen laughed from her chair. "Go ahead and call them. When they get here, we will tell them all about your hostile behavior and refusal to be a decent neighbor. I am sure they will be very interested in your harassment." I nodded seriously, still holding my phone to my ear. "Yes, they are refusing to leave my private property, about 20 people total. They gained access by copying my security code without permission." While I spoke, I activated the smart lock override function. The gate was now sealed electronically, completely separate from the manual keypad. Even if Karen knew the code, she could not get out. Only my phone app could unlock it now. "They are being led by my neighbor who has a history of boundary violations." I continued into my phone. "I have everything documented on video." Karen rolled her eyes and addressed her guests. "He is just trying to scare us. The police are not going to arrest people for using a pool. This is not communist China." I finished my fake phone call and put my phone away. Then I walked calmly toward the pool gate, making sure everyone could see me. Karen was still lecturing her guests about property rights and community values, completely oblivious to what was happening. I reached the gate and turned to face the crowd. "Last chance," I announced. "Anyone who wants to leave now can walk out with no problems." Karen stood up dramatically. "Nobody is leaving. We are not going to be bullied by someone who thinks he owns the whole neighborhood." I smiled and pulled out my phone again. This time I held it up so everyone could see the screen. "You are absolutely right, Karen. I cannot force you to leave." I tapped the screen, and the smart lock clicked into place with a definitive electronic beep. "But I can make sure you stay." Karen stared at me in confusion for several seconds. Then she walked over to the gate and tried to enter the code on the keypad. Nothing happened. She tried again, pressing the numbers more deliberately. Still nothing. "What did you do?" she demanded, panic creeping into her voice. "I locked the gate remotely," I explained calmly. "You see, when you copied my security code, you probably thought you were very clever. But you did not realize that I upgraded to a smart lock system specifically because of your previous boundary violations." Karen rattled the gate handle frantically. Her confident smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by growing panic as she realized she was trapped in my pool area with 20 strangers. "You cannot do this," she screamed. "This is false imprisonment. This is illegal." I shrugged. "Actually, this is my private property and you are all trespassers. I have every right to control access to my own backyard." The party atmosphere evaporated instantly. Karen's guests were no longer cheering her defiant stand. They were staring at the locked gate and realizing that their fearless leader had gotten them trapped in a very awkward situation. Karen grabbed the fence and tried to shake it, looking for weak spots or ways to climb over. But the fence was solid and 6 feet high. There was no way out except through the gate I now controlled. "Let us out right now," she demanded. I sat down in one of my pool chairs and made myself comfortable. "Well, Karen, you said you wanted to stay, so stay." The transformation in Karen's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The confident, entitled neighbor who had been lecturing me about community values was gone, replaced by a panicked woman rattling a locked gate and screaming demands. Her carefully constructed image of righteousness crumbled in real time as she realized the trap she had walked into. "You cannot keep us here," she shrieked, pulling on the gate handle with both hands. "This is kidnapping. This is illegal detention. I am calling the police." "Please do," I replied calmly, pulling out my own phone. I was just about to do the same thing. While Karen frantically dialed 911, I called the non-emergency police line. I had learned from previous research that trespassing calls were handled differently when reported calmly versus as emergencies. I wanted the responding officers to arrive with a clear understanding of the situation. I need to report multiple trespassers on my private property, I explained to the dispatcher. They gained access by copying my security code without permission. The primary trespasser is my neighbor, who has a documented history of boundary violations. I have video evidence of everything. Behind me, Karen was screaming into her phone about being falsely imprisoned by her psychotic neighbor. Her version of events painted me as an unhinged homeowner who had lured innocent people into my backyard and trapped them against their will. But while Karen focused on her dramatic phone call, something interesting was happening with her guests. The mob mentality that had supported her defiant stand was rapidly dissolving. People were no longer cheering her on or nodding in agreement with her speeches about community values. "Karen," said one woman hesitantly, "you told us he said we could use his pool. You said he was out of town and had given you permission." Karen barely looked up from her phone call. "He should have given permission. Look at this pool just sitting here empty." "But you lied to us," said another guest. "You told us this was arranged. You said he was your friend." More people were speaking up now, and their tone was decidedly unfriendly. "I never would have come if I knew we were trespassing," said one man. "You said this was a neighborhood pool party." "You got us all trapped here because of your lies," added another woman. "My kids are with me, Karen. What were you thinking?" Karen finally hung up from her call and whirled around to face her increasingly hostile guests. "Stop being dramatic. This will all be sorted out when the police get here. He is the one who committed a crime by locking us in here." But her guests were no longer buying her narrative. The same people who had been cheering her defiant stand 20 minutes earlier were now backing away from her and directing their anger at the person who had gotten them into this mess. I continued documenting everything on my phone, capturing Karen's meltdown and her guests' growing realization that they had been manipulated into trespassing. The evidence was getting better by the minute. Karen made several more attempts to escape, including trying to climb the fence and looking for tools to break the lock. Each failed attempt increased her panic and made her behavior more erratic. She was screaming, crying, and making increasingly wild threats about what she was going to do to me when she got out. "I am going to sue you for everything you own," she yelled. "I am going to make sure you lose this house. You are going to pay for this." "Karen," I said quietly, "you might want to focus your energy on explaining to the police how you got my security code and why you thought it was acceptable to bring 20 people into my backyard without permission." The first police car arrived within 15 minutes, followed quickly by 2 more. I watched through the fence as 3 officers approached my backyard, their expressions serious and professional. Karen immediately ran to the fence and began screaming about false imprisonment and demanding immediate rescue. "Officers, thank God you are here," she called out dramatically. "This man has trapped us in his backyard and will not let us leave. He is holding us against our will." One of the officers looked at me calmly. "Sir, can you please unlock the gate so we can assess the situation?" I nodded and pulled out my phone. "Absolutely, officer. I want to cooperate fully." I opened the app and unlocked the gate with a simple tap. The officers entered my pool area and immediately began separating people for individual interviews. Karen continued her dramatic performance, but I noticed that several of her guests were volunteering information about how Karen had misled them about having permission to be there. One officer approached me while his colleagues dealt with the crowd. "Can you walk me through what happened here, sir?" I handed him my phone, which was still recording. Everything is documented, officer. It started when I came home from work early and found 23 people in my locked pool area. My neighbor Karen somehow obtained my security code and organized this gathering without my knowledge or permission. The officer reviewed the video footage while Karen continued her increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her own guests were contradicting her version of events. "Ma'am," the officer finally said to Karen, "I need you to calm down so we can sort this out. Based on what I am seeing and hearing, there are some serious questions about how you gained access to this property." Karen's face went pale as she realized that her victim narrative was not working. The officers were treating this as a trespassing case, not a false imprisonment case. Her entitled behavior had finally met consequences that she could not manipulate or talk her way out of. But this was just the beginning. I had also called the HOA. The HOA president arrived just as the police were finishing their initial interviews. Margaret Sullivan was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had dealt with neighborhood disputes for over a decade. She took one look at the scene in my backyard and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. "I came as soon as I got your call," she said to me quietly. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we have been documenting about Karen for months." That statement surprised me. "You have been documenting her behavior." Margaret nodded grimly. "We have received multiple complaints about boundary violations, harassment, and general disruptive behavior. But we never had clear evidence or witnesses willing to go on record. This changes everything." The lead police officer approached us with his notepad and a serious expression. "Sir, I have reviewed your security footage and interviewed multiple witnesses. The evidence clearly shows that your neighbor gained unauthorized access to your property by copying your security code without permission." "What does that mean legally?" I asked. "It means she committed criminal trespass and potentially theft of services since she used your pool facilities," the officer explained. "The fact that she brought 23 other people onto your property compounds the violation." Karen overheard this conversation and came rushing over, her face red with anger and panic. "This is ridiculous. You cannot arrest people for using a swimming pool. This is America." The officer looked at her calmly. "Ma'am, this is private property. You did not have permission to be here, and you gained access by copying a security code without authorization. That constitutes criminal trespass under state law." "But I am his neighbor," Karen protested. "Neighbors share things. This is what community is supposed to be about." Margaret stepped forward with a folder in her hand. "Karen, you are facing multiple violations of the HOA covenant and bylaws. Trespassing on neighbor property, disturbing the peace, organizing unauthorized gatherings, and violating the community standards for respectful behavior." Karen stared at the folder like it contained a death sentence. "You cannot be serious. This is about one afternoon at a pool." "This is about a pattern of behavior that has been escalating for months," Margaret replied firmly. "We have documented complaints about your boundary violations, your harassment of neighbors, and your general disregard for community rules." The police officer continued writing citations while Karen's guests were escorted out of my pool area. Most of them apologized to me as they left, clearly embarrassed about being manipulated into trespassing. Several of them made pointed comments to Karen about her dishonesty. "I trusted you," said one woman angrily. "I brought my children here because you said this was arranged. You lied to all of us." You made us all look like criminals, added another guest. I am never speaking to you again. Karen watched her social circle crumble in real time as people distanced themselves from her and her behavior. The same people who had been enjoying her pool party were now treating her like a pariah who had gotten them into legal trouble. The police officer handed Karen a citation for criminal trespass. You are being issued a formal citation. You will need to appear in court to address these charges. This is insane, Karen screamed. All of this over a swimming pool. You people have lost your minds. Margaret handed her a formal letter from the HOA. You are also being fined for multiple covenant violations. You have 30 days to respond to these charges or face additional penalties. Karen's hands were shaking as she read the letter. The financial penalties were substantial, and the threat of further action was clearly outlined. Her face went through a range of expressions as she realized the full scope of the consequences she was facing. You are all ganging up on me, she said desperately. This is harassment. This is discrimination. I am being targeted because you do not like strong women who stand up for themselves. The police officer closed his notepad and looked at her seriously. Ma'am, this has nothing to do with discrimination. This is about respecting other people's property and following the law. I suggest you use this citation as an opportunity to reconsider your approach to neighbor relations. As the authorities prepared to leave, I felt a sense of vindication that went beyond simple revenge. Karen's entitled behavior had finally met consequences that she could not manipulate, intimidate, or charm her way out of. The system had worked exactly as it was supposed to work. But the real victory was not in the citations or the fines. It was in watching Karen's carefully constructed image of herself as a righteous victim crumble under the weight of documented evidence and legal consequences. Her pool party had become her reckoning, and it was far from over. 3 weeks later, I was floating peacefully in my pool on a Sunday morning when my wife brought me a cup of coffee and the local newspaper. The headline made me smile. Local woman faces fines for pool trespassing. Karen had made the news, but not in the way she probably hoped. The article detailed her court appearance, the substantial fines she faced, and the HOA restrictions that now governed her behavior. She had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of entitled neighbor behavior. The legal aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Karen pled no contest to the trespassing charges and was ordered to pay fines totaling over $3,000. The HOA imposed additional penalties and placed her on probation for covenant violations. She was also required to attend mediation training and submit a written apology to affected neighbors. But the social consequences were even more significant. Word of the pool incident spread throughout the neighborhood faster than I could have imagined. Karen's reputation as an entitled boundary violator was now public knowledge, and people began sharing their own stories about her problematic behavior. The pool party guests who had supported her defiant stand all distanced themselves from her completely. Several of them approached me over the following weeks to apologize again and share their embarrassment about being manipulated into trespassing. Karen's social circle, which had once enabled her behavior, completely collapsed. My pool area returned to being the peaceful sanctuary I had worked so hard to create. But now it represented something more significant. It was proof that entitled behavior could be stopped when people documented everything and used proper legal channels. I upgraded my security system again, adding more cameras and improving the smart lock technology. But honestly, Karen had not attempted any boundary violations since the incident. The consequences had been severe enough to modify her behavior permanently. The neighborhood dynamic changed completely. Other residents felt empowered to set boundaries with problem neighbors, knowing that documentation and proper procedures could lead to real consequences. Several people thanked me for standing up to Karen's bullying behavior. 6 months later, Karen put her house on the market and moved away. She never spoke to me again after the court proceedings, which was perfectly fine with me. The new neighbors who bought her house were respectful, friendly people who understood basic property boundaries. As I floated in my pool that Sunday morning, reading about Karen's legal troubles in the newspaper, I reflected on the lessons learned. Entitled behavior thrives when good people avoid confrontation. But when bullies face documented consequences and legal accountability, they quickly discover that their manipulation tactics have limits. Sometimes the best way to deal with a Karen is to let her trap herself. And sometimes justice really is as sweet as floating in your own pool on a perfect Sunday morning, knowing that your boundaries are respected and your peace is secure.